Thanks. Right. Hi. Good afternoon. Thank you all for tuning into this seminar. And thank you, Alex, and the Institute for Advanced Studies at LOVRA for their very kind invitation to speak today. Okay, so just to give you a bit of context, my presentation is part of a larger book project on civil resistance. And normally when we talk about civil resistance, the first thing that comes to mind is popular insurrections against authoritarian regimes in places like Serbia or Sudan, Egypt, and more. But civil resistance is a multifaceted tool that can be used to achieve a variety of political goals. And what I wanted to say in my book is that it can be used in context of protracted terrorist campaigns. Not only that, in the particular case of Basque Country in northern Spain, civil action played a very important role in reducing violence and containing the cost of the conflict. So that's the argument in my book. And in this short presentation, what I want to do is to give you a taster of some of the themes on this work in progress that is this piece of research. So moving to our case, as some of you may know, 4 years ago, on May 2nd, 2018, the Basque separatist organization Euskadi Askatasuna, or ETA, it formally announced that it was disbanding. Despite the usual bravado, it was clear in the communiqué that this was the end of the organization. Exhausted, desperately out of touch, ETA had finally decided to throw in the towel. Even their own supporters were tired of them. If ETA had taken that step, it was precisely because they were pressured into doing so by their own political movement, the Izquierda Abertzale, the so-called Basque Patriotic Left. But it wasn't always like this. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, during the transition from the Franco dictatorship to a democratic system in Spain, ETA was militarily powerful. It had hundreds of new recruits every year, and it enjoyed a significant degree of popular support. In fact, seemingly every other day, there would be marches, demonstrations, violent protests, and large shows of public support for ETA. And on the other hand, there seemed to be very little visible opposition to the organization inside Basque Country. So the obvious question is, of course, how can we make sense of this reversal? What explains this long, steep decline in ETA's standing? When trying to explain this, scholars usually refer to 4 different factors. One is the concession of more autonomy to the Basque Country by the Spanish state. Another is ETA's own strategic mistakes and atrocities. There's also, of course, improved police and judicial cooperation by the Spanish authorities, and an increased collaboration with the French that kind of started to erode the image of invulnerability that ETA had been enjoying for so long. But in this presentation, what I want to do is to leave those 4 factors aside for a moment and focus on one other factor that's been often ignored in the international literature. And I'm referring here to social mobilization against violence. So what I argue is that collective action has had a very important role to play in the decline of ETA as a political and military force. And by collective action, I mean the activism of the peace movement that emerges in the 1980s, and then the mobilization by civic groups and victims organizations that joined them a bit later in the 1990s. So these actors were the spearhead of the Basque social rebellion against ETA, and they achieved 2 important goals. First, they helped to erode public support for the organization, and second, they strengthened community resilience to ETA's violent narratives. More specifically, what I like to argue is that these actors influence the trajectory of the conflict according to 4 different mechanisms. So by challenging the existing discourses about the violence, by introducing and promoting a culture of peace and human rights, by helping to protect the fabric of society, and by undermining ETA's pillars of support. And those are the factors that I like to develop in the rest of my presentation. So let's start first with a culture of peace. Now, the roots of civil resistance to ETA, they lie in the peace movement that emerges in the mid-1980s to mobilize against political violence in Basque Country. Now, this peace movement, it grows very rapidly in the late 1980s, and then over the following decade, it becomes enormously active in society. Now, the most important of these groups was Gesto por la Paz, a gesture for peace, but there were also other smaller organizations that formed part of the movement during this period. I think what is crucial here is that we need to understand that what these peace groups actually do is to behave as norm entrepreneurs. They promote tolerance, nonviolence, and other democratic values, values that are democratically opposed to those espoused by ETA's political movement. So these are, in a nutshell, civilian actors that are engaged in norm diffusion. They help to inculcate in the public consciousness a culture of peace and human rights. Now, this public activism, it was very important to delegitimize the use of violence as a political tool, but it's important to realize that this is a process that took years. It required decades of constant, persistent, low-key and committed work by activists and leaders, and also, of course, a crucial contribution by other political actors, such as public institutions, political parties, journalists, and intellectuals. What is also interesting is how these actors decide to convey these new narratives, because what these groups do is to resort to classical social mobilization. So they mostly use what Burroughs has categorized as methods of concentration. So marches, public performances, sit-ins, mass demonstrations, and so on and so forth. Why these methods work? Well, basically because these methods of concentration, they act as signifiers to the rest of society that, in fact, the opposition to ETA was very strong within the community. And that wasn't clear before they did that. And naturally, in the process, what they do is to occupy public spaces. And these spaces were in the past controlled by the Izquierda Abertzale for their own political expression. In fact, in the late 1970s and the 1980s, ETA supporters had almost a complete hegemony of the public arena. So what these groups do is actually to undermine that. So in promoting their alternative narratives in public, they also challenge the Izquierda Abertzale's use of the street as a mechanism for social control. This is tied to what the scholar Maria Jesus Funes has described as exiting the spiral of silence. Now, a spiral of silence is a well-known concept in communication studies. And basically what it is when individuals engage in self-censorship because they believe that their own views are not shared by the wider public. So in this case, many Basques were reluctant to show their opposition to ETA, because they actually fear of being targeted. Of course, that's a big factor, but also because they believe that it was an unpopular opinion, that they didn't want to be ostracized or socially excluded for that. But through their activism, what these groups actually do is to signal to the rest of society that opposition to ETA is in fact the consensus view. So by pushing back against this spiral of silence, these groups and other political actors, they completely reverted the situation. They helped make the repudiation of ETA become the mainstream socially acceptable view. So this public activism by the peace movement was very important to delegitimize the use of violence. But in the late 1990s, there are a group of activists and academics and intellectuals that started to argue that actually that wasn't enough, that resistance to ETA has to be more forceful, it has to be more political as well. So they want to form a number of civil society groups that came to be known as the civic movement. This is a quite diverse network. Included, for instance, victims organizations like COVITE, political foundations like Fundación para la Libertad, intellectual forums like the Foro Hermoa, or an activist group, a very important one, in fact, called Basta Ya. So what all these groups have in common is that they do not stop at simply protesting against the violence and do so on ethical grounds. They do more than that. They promote a clear political discourse in opposition to ETA. So through their manifestos and books and articles in newspapers, they start dismantling in their work the historical and political myths that sustain the Izquierda Abertzale's narratives. So they reject that ETA's campaign was a product of an ancient historic conflict between the Spanish and the Basque, as the Abertzales claim. Instead, what they argue is that, in fact, it is ETA who is responsible for the violence. because they were carrying out in order to impose a totalitarian political project that was predicated upon the extermination of dissidents and political opponents. A project as well that it was opposed by the overwhelming majority of the Basques. So we can see now that with the arrival of the civic movement, the rejection of ETA extended to the sphere of ideas. And we see that they start pushing back against the radical ideology and political discourse. Now, this discursive response is important because it came at a very difficult time for ETA's opponents. Once ETA and Izquierda Abertzale realized about the impact that this public revolt was having, they changed tactics. And in the mid-1990s, they introduced a new strategy to violently repress the thousands of their adversaries, very much in order to reassert the control of public spaces. In practice, this actually meant that the target selection widened to include a large number of categories of individuals. So now we have local politicians, town mayors, judges, lawyers, journalists, intellectuals, academics, very much any public critic of the organization. So while the numbers of those in ETA's kill list increased massively, other organizations within the movement became involved in large-scale street violence and the persecution of ETA's opponents. Now, it is important to realize that the numbers of those who start now to become directly affected by the violence are actually staggering. There is this report by Cristo por la Paz that estimated that more than 40,000 people were being directly affected by these new forms of violence. This, of course, is an estimation, but we know for sure it is a fact that more than 2,000 people were under police protection 24/7 at the start of the notice. And what is relevant for our case is that these leaders and representatives of the civic movement, they become ETA's priority targets. So that means that they were harassed, they were physically assaulted, they received death threats, and they also require police protection. It basically, we basically see here a perfect example of high-risk collective action. Now, being under police protection it was obviously a very big deal. It basically meant that their social life was heavily affected by that. Interviewers have described to me how often it felt like being under house arrest. There would be places they couldn't go. There would be acquaintances who would disappear from their lives. Some had to leave their homes and jobs and live exile in other parts of Spain, or even move abroad to different countries. Now, some suffered attempts on their lives, and a number of them were killed by the organization. You can see in this slide at the very top is Fernando Buesa, who is he was the leader of the Basque Socialist Party. He attended one of the demonstrations by the Bastalla movement. He was a clear and self-confessed supporter of the civic movement. He was murdered by ETA with a car bomb in the year 2000. In the middle, we see Joseba Pagasartundua, a well-known member of Bastalla, who was also killed by the organization. The woman walking behind the coffin in the funeral in that picture, she is Maite Pagasartundua. She was Joseba's sister, and she became a very important figure in the victims community and in the civic movement as a whole. And we see in the bottom picture that's José Luis López de la Calle, a communist, a former anti-Franco fighter, someone who spent years of his life in Franco prisons, who became a journalist during democracy. He became a founder of the Foro Hermoa and Bastalla, and he was killed, shot and killed by ETA because of that during this period. However, despite all this, broader social opposition continued. The rallies after each murder, the demonstrations, the articles in the newspapers, the books telling the stories of ETA's victims, and the civic groups, they contributed in their own way to this opposition. And they did so by channeling in a constructive, empowering manner the feelings of anger and frustration and helplessness that existed within the non-nationalist community. These positive personal feelings. They were sublimated into the promotion and support of democratic norms, liberal values, and the rule of law. So by advocating for these values and persisting in their activism while suffering violent harassment, they helped to preserve the social fabric of society. And just leading into the final key contribution the civil society organizations did. I'd like to refer to the activities of one of these groups, El Carri. It was generally considered as part of the peace movement, but really what it was is an organization specialized in conflict resolution and mediation. And during its life, it engaged in contacts with Basque political parties and the Izquierda Abertzale, very much trying to reach a broad political agreement to resolve the conflict. So in that, they were heavily influenced by the Northern Ireland peace process. But more than that, more than these kind of efforts, that they were to a certain degree unsuccessful. What I think makes them interesting and important is that originally they were born within the Izquierda Abertzale itself. In fact, their two founders, they were Abertzale politicians. But what distinguishes them from the rest of the movement is that they rejected violence. So as insiders, they start attracting those who agreed with them, with the political goal, but they were uneasy about ETA's armed struggle. So they weakened ETA by bringing dissidents together and draining away support for violence from within their political movement. In other words, they helped to erode ETA's pillars of support, not from the outside, as the others were doing, but from the inside. And it's precisely the fact that they were part of the movement in the beginning what gave them the credibility to do so. So these past roots with the Basque nationalism is what boosted the influence of El Carri and their successor organization, Lo Carri. They were able to couch their nonviolence message in a language that the Abertzale base could actually understand. So over the years, thanks to their efforts and ETA's own military decline, we see how rejection of ETA grew within the Abertzale movement. And we reach a point at the end of the 90s when there are these Abertzale politicians who oppose armed struggle, and they started to use these concepts and ideas and discourses that El Carri and Lo Carri had developed over the years in order to persuade the rest of the base to stop supporting violence. And this is how we reach this final point in which the Abertzale political movement pressurized this armed actor in order to lay down his arms. So to conclude, it is my view that collective action has had a very meaningful impact in the trajectory on the conflict, and there are three observations or takeaways that we can make about this case that may be relevant to other contexts. Like the first is that in some conflicts, the impact of nonviolent activism, it may lie in its capacity to shape the socio-political context, but it is important to realize that this transformation may be slow, subtle, and happen over a long period of time. Now, second, in order to make a difference, these actors do not need to influence directly the strategies of the armed groups. This is a common assumption in the literature of civil resistance. We saw that in Colombia. There's evidence of that happening, that these actors, they can impact on the strategies of the opponents. But what I wanted to say with my work is that this is not the whole story, that there's more to it, right? That these civilian actors can contribute in their own way to reduce violence indirectly by undermining social support for the militants in a community. They can act as a firewall against terrorist recruitment by formulating new frames that damage the prestige of militants within the community. Well, there are other interesting insights, but I'm conscious of the time, so perhaps we can discuss them during the Q&A. Thank you so much.